Welcome, Silurians. We begin our program today with a tribute to a journalist who will replace us. She is Emily Nadal, winner of the Silurians Press Club Dennis Duggan Award, given to a student at Newmark CUNY Graduate Journalism School for outstanding coverage in New York City. She was chosen for this honor by the faculty of the school. Emily was born in Washington Heights and still lives there. She had an interesting life before journalism as, among other jobs, a park ranger, which she will tell us about. Emily Labor Warren, director of the J School's Health and Science Reporting Program and one of Emily's professors, says of her, Emily has a gift for entering into communities and finding untold local stories, such as about how climate change is limiting access to outdoor recreation for low-income people. She is now working on a final master's project about women who give birth in prison and how the incarceration of mothers reverberates across generations. Emily is already at work in the larger journalism community. Her work has appeared in City Limits, the Brooklyn Eagle, the Manhattan Times, Bronx Free Press, Mott Haven Herald, Brooklyner, and other publications. She's also produced a series of podcasts and is interned at NBC. Her award includes a $2,000 stipend, and here she is to tell us how she will spend it. Emily?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you for this incredible recognition. I'm sorry if you hear my dog in the background. She's eating very loudly. I'm so honored that the faculty at CUNY decided that my work was representative and deserving of an award in Dennis Duggan's name, a journalist who continues to be a New York icon and one who really embodies the type of work that I strive for, which is work that captures the heart and the essence of this great city that I've called home for my entire life. I came into journalism because I love telling stories. Before deciding to come to graduate school, I had another job that also centered storytelling, as Michael mentioned. I was a park ranger for the National Park Service, where I connected with people from all over the country and from different parts of the world to share stories. And it was through that job where I was able to really understand the power of my role in making those connections. And I wanted to take those lessons further and harness the power that comes from storytelling and use it to make an even bigger impact. From my first semester at CUNY, I was covering communities that are considered news deserts. And it was in these places that I learned the most valuable lessons of journalism, which for me really come down to listening to the people whose stories I'm telling, listening to the needs of the community, listening to the problems they're facing, but also listening for solutions. My favorite stories in graduate school have been focused on community-led solution efforts. I've been able to follow and cover stories about plans to cap the Cross Bronx Expressway so that Bronx residents can have a better air quality, or a story about young people in Washington Heights using skateboarding as an outlet and a way to remember and honor their late friend. Reporting on the bad things like crime certainly has its place and purpose in journalism. But I think also remembering to incorporate these solutions to issues is critical to the future of journalism, and also necessary to becoming a more conscious, inclusive journalist, which I aim to be in my career. And my time at CUNY has given me the tools and skills to be able to accomplish this. So in just 2 days, I'll be graduating with my master's in health and science journalism. I came to this school and to the field in general really committed to audio as a medium. But over the past year and a half, I've been able to make stories come to life in many different formats, along with making beautiful narrated or non-narrated audio pieces. I've written countless feature stories and made videos about everything from graffiti to clemency, and even had the chance to use data to find stories and make interactive graphics. I've also had the opportunity to take these skills outside of school to various internships, like writing for the Brooklyn Eagle in the spring to investigating stories for broadcast over the summer and this past fall with NBC. In all these places and through all these media, I've learned more about the journalist I want to be. And the biggest takeaway that I have come to realize is that to be a journalist is to really be a public servant. And what we do is a service to people. And with that comes a great responsibility to do it right and to do it with integrity and to use our power for good. And that is the idea that will be the driving force for me as I start my professional career in just a few days. So I want to say thank you all again for this award, and I'm very, very grateful to be honored in such a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Where are you beginning your career, by the way?
I just accepted a job offer last week with 1010 Wins and WCBS as their digital content producer.
Oh, cool. Congratulations. Fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be starting in January.
Okay. Well, that makes it for a more joyous holiday for you.
Yeah, and also it's really nice because I'll have a little bit of a break in between graduation and starting my job.
Okay. Well, thank you very much and good luck.
Thank you. So sorry about my dog. She's something else.
Feel free to stay and listen to Peter Bergen, but our program today is an interesting one. We welcome Peter Bergen, a journalist, historian, national security analyst. Beginning in 2012 with the well-reviewed The Longest War, Peter has authored a series of books on the U.S.'s war against terrorism, most recently a biography of Osama Bin Laden that includes details about Bin Laden's life and his personal war against the West, never published before. Peter is also a frequent commentator on daily news events as an analyst for CNN.com. Recent topics have included the unnecessary death toll from the COVID virus, an analysis of the role of H.R. McMaster in the Trump administration, and the foreign policy mistakes that he helped Trump make, U.S. General's view of the quick withdrawal from Afghanistan, and other topics. Peter.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And Emily, congratulations on the award. And thank you to Eileen Jacobson for enabling this, and also her husband, Rich Gallant, who's my editor at CNN.com, who's had the unenviable task of editing at least 500,000 of my words. It might be even 750,000 at this point. So I was asked to just make some general observations, maybe about, I'll start with the war in Afghanistan. If you look at President Biden's approval ratings, they really never recovered from the poorly executed withdrawal from Afghanistan. It seemed to undercut any kind of narrative about competence in the administration. In my own view, however, the withdrawal was more than, it wasn't simply a poorly executed withdrawal. It was a very poor policy decision on a few levels. One, I thought no Democratic president would, either he or she would make the mistake of withdrawing from Afghanistan, which are really very few political upsides to, in the sense that, yes, if you ask Americans, should we get out of Afghanistan, they're going to, certainly before the withdrawal, they were going to largely say yes. But there was no huge constituency that was kind of satisfied by the decision to pull out. And of course, it turned into a total fiasco. And I always thought a Democratic president, because of a narrative that the Democrats are weak on national security, wouldn't take this risk, particularly early on in their term, when the likelihood that something blows back on you is higher when you make this decision in the first 6 months of your term in office. So, what can happen in Afghanistan that would sort of change the politics around this? a number of things, I think, and President Marco Rubio, President Donald Trump, President Joe Biden, President Kamala Harris, pick your president of the future, could easily change his or her mind about what our policy is to Afghanistan, similar to what President Obama did after Tony Blinken and then Vice President Biden negotiated the Iraq withdrawal. 3 years later, the United States was back in Iraq because of the rise of ISIS. So there are a few things I think that can happen in Afghanistan that would change the politics around it. First of all, the Taliban could engage in ethnic cleansing, which they certainly have done in the past. That was the trigger for Obama. It wasn't the murder of Jim Foley, although that was important, that precipitated Obama's change of mind in Iraq. It was the threat of genocide against the Yazidis. And Jim Foley's murder amplified that decision, but wasn't the precipitant of the decision. So the Taliban could engage in ethnic cleansing, one. Two, Europeans could start showing up in Afghanistan for training by any number of the jihadi groups that are there, and then carry out an attack in Europe, similar to the Paris attacks of 2015, in which 130 people were killed in Paris, including a number of Americans, by ISIS and ISIS-trained terrorists. Three, there could be an attack on an American target in the region in South Asia, an American Express office, or pick your kind of American target by terrorists traceable to the Afghan-Pakistan region. And four, jihadi groups in Afghanistan could start calling for homegrown attacks in the West. It's similar to what we saw with ISIS, which is the Orlando attack, the San Bernardino attack carried out by soldiers of ISIS, where, of course, these soldiers of ISIS had never gone to Syria or Iraq, but were merely inspired by the declaration of the caliphate. So that's all things that could change the politics around this. Also more immediately, one thing the Taliban are not good at is actually governing a state. ISIS elites had pretensions in that direction, and had, Syria and Iraq are more sophisticated societies. The people who are in ISIS, a number of them were Saddam Hussein era officers. I mean, there was a higher level of competence about running a state. And I spent time in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Taliban had no plans for governance in a real sense. They believe that if you make society pure, that everything else will follow and everything else will get taken care of. Well, that's not a program for putting the electricity on or putting the water on, and it's certainly a program that is probably going to lead to a catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe that we see unfolding in Afghanistan now, where 97% of the population may be below the poverty line and millions of people may starve. So in a more immediately, even before, kind of a jihadist issue emerges in Afghanistan, there's this huge humanitarian issue that is unfolding. And just to briefly mention that I recently wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Osama Bin Laden. I wrote that book for a couple of reasons. One, I teach at Arizona State, and some of my students, I realized, weren't born on 9/11. So 9/11 for them is as distant memory as the Korean War is for me, which is I don't remember the Korean War. I wasn't born then. And for some of my students, they weren't born on 9/11. Of course, 9/11 continues to influence politics and national security in ways that the Korean War didn't. Kind of continue to influence American domestic politics and American national security. But it is something that's entered into history for anybody who's volunteering for the military. Those 13 American men and women who were killed at the Abbey Gate at Kabul airport, many of them were not born or were very, very young when 9/11 happened. So that was sort of one element. And then the other element was, it was only during the late 2017, that the Trump administration released all the documents that were found in Abbottabad, 470,000 files. They were only released in full by the Trump administration. They'd been released by the Obama administration, the most important documents, but they're finally released at the end of December, the end of 2017. And so those documents are a really wonderful roadmap to what Bin Laden was thinking as in the last weeks of his life, the last months of his life, the last years of his life, how he is interacting with his family. And a couple, 3 or 4 takeaways from the documents before I take questions. One, Bin Laden was completely befuddled by the Arab Spring. He didn't know what to say about it. Here was he understood this to be the most momentous event in the Middle East in centuries. And yet his ideas, his followers, his Al-Qaeda were not involved in it. And so he started holding nightly meetings with his two oldest wives, who both of whom had PhDs, and also his two oldest daughters. And they were trying to figure out what he could say publicly to somehow take charge of the Arab Spring, because they understood that he was being silent, and they also labored under the delusion that if he gave a speech, he could somehow take control of the events of the Arab Spring. And so they started writing a Bin Laden family journal, which is a 222-page document written in Arabic, sort of documenting their discussions every night. And that is a very interesting. I love documents. I love primary documents. I love documents that people don't expect ever to see the light of day. And the Bin Laden about documents are a treasure trove. Bin Laden was also concerned his two bodyguards were abandoning him. They were both fed up with protecting the world's most wanted man, getting paid $100 a month. They were basically planning to leave, and that was a huge problem for him, because the bodyguards were doing everything for him, from buying necessary items to eat, or taking messages to other members of Al-Qaeda. He was also very concerned about the fact that he hadn't attacked the United States again. He had all sorts of harebrained ideas about how to do that, all of which were fairly delusional. Kill President Barack Obama, kill David Petraeus, none of which really had any reality. And he was thinking about rebranding Al-Qaeda as a group that no longer wantonly killed Muslim civilians. He was thinking of relaunching the group, renaming it. And the 10th anniversary of 9/11 was looming. He was thinking about using that as a moment to relaunch Al-Qaeda. So these were the things that were weighing on his mind in the weeks and months before he was killed on May 2nd, 2011. Anyway, if you have the slightest interest in the subject, I hope you take a look at the book. So with those preliminary observations, I'll take any questions. What happened to the Arab Spring? It failed. And I mean, if you look at in country after country, Sisi is, I think, much worse than Mubarak in terms of his human rights record. In Yemen, it sort of crashed and failed, and we have the Houthis who control much of the country and a civil war. In Libya, we continue to have a civil war with, actually, very interestingly, multiple countries such as Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, France, the United States, Russia, Turkey, all involved in one way or another over the past 10 years, sort of aiding one side or another in the Libyan civil war. Only in Tunisia did it achieve very much. And unfortunately, the Arab Spring, I don't think it's, if you take the long view, certain forces that were unleashed by the Arab Spring aren't simply going to disappear. But by and large, the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter. As a result of the Arab Spring, ISIS became very strong in Libya. It was only a U.S. air campaign against ISIS in 2016 that kind of wiped out their geographical toehold in Libya. So, I think it goes to the wider question of for these jihadi groups is they're not very strong themselves, but they prey on weak hosts. So the weaker the host, the stronger these jihadi groups are. So in countries with relatively competent governments, say Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, these groups find it hard to function. In countries where there is no government or a failed government, Yemen, Somalia, now Afghanistan, these groups are going to fare pretty well.
Yeah, could I ask you, why did it take the United States 10 years to find Bin Laden?
Everybody on this call, I think, remembers Whitey Bulger. It took 20 years to find Whitey Bulger in the United States.
Yeah.
Not for a lack of trying. So, which is, by the way, Rumsfeld was asked the same question, and he said a very Rumsfeldian thing, which is, the world's a very big place. And that was his answer. And I mean, I don't think that's completely crazy. And, Bin Laden was being, very careful about everything that he was doing. He was, he faced a dilemma, which is if he'd said absolutely nothing, he made no attempt to control his organization, he'd probably still be alive today. But he was releasing videotapes. Those tapes had to be transported to media outlets by couriers. He was releasing, he was sending instructions to leaders of Al-Qaeda, trying to maintain control of the organization. If he hadn't done that, he wouldn't have been found. But he really disappeared for a long time. There were no leads. And one of the key sources for me in reconstructing what happened is a Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, coercive interrogations. Now, the intent of that report was not to outline the hunt for Bin Laden, but this is a major work of history. We only have the unclassified version, but there are, I think, like 3,000 footnotes. It's 500 pages long. And it has a very good account of what happened to Al-Qaeda after the fall of the Taliban. And also it has a good account of what Bin Laden, kind of what was known about Bin Laden, and declassified a lot of useful information. And so, this was an Agatha Christie story. It wasn't there was no like magic bullet answer to like, where is Bin Laden? The CIA began to realize that no detainee would actually know this. And the few detainees, by the way, one of the big arguments that the defenders of the CIA coercive interrogation program have made is that, the people who had some element of knowledge about Bin Laden's whereabouts were people who were coercively interrogated, and they gave up false information about Bin Laden's whereabouts, yet at the same time they gave up real information about certain Al-Qaeda plots. Well, this is a completely logically incoherent kind of defense of the interrogation program, that people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would lie about information about leading to Bin Laden, but would tell the truth about other things. And in fact, 5 of people who were coercively interrogated gave up inaccurate information about Bin Laden and the courier network that led to him. And so the CIA's defense of all this makes no sense. But if you read the report, it's clear that that all elements of American intelligence led to Bin Laden, and it was whether it was signals intelligence, whether it was liaison with foreign intelligence agencies, whether it was some detainees giving up accurate information. By the way, those detainees gave that information up in many cases previous to being coercively interrogated.
Where do you think the Pakistani Secret Service, or whatever it's called these days, fits into keeping Bin Laden going?
Not at all. I mean, because Bin Laden was discovered to be living about a mile from the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, many people naturally supposed that somehow he was being protected by the Pakistanis, but there's no evidence for that in any of the documents that were released. And there's a very good book that's coming out soon. The only person who's read all the documents in Arabic is a woman called Nellie Lahoud, who's a colleague of mine at New America. She's publishing a book in spring, and she's read all the original documents in Arabic. And she and I have come to the same conclusion, which is, of course, it's hard to prove negatives, but there was no Pakistani officer protecting Bin Laden. There was no Pakistani official who was aware where Bin Laden was. And I interviewed probably 24 people who were listening in or privy to the intelligence that night during the raid. And they all agree that the Pakistanis were totally surprised about what was going on. They had no idea. They knew there was a strange helicopter crash. They knew it wasn't theirs, but they really had no idea what was going on. This is not, and so, and just one final point on this, Bin Laden was hiding from people on his own compound. He was being very careful. So one of the bodyguard's wives didn't know that Osama Bin Laden was the mysterious tall man who was also living on the same large compound with them. Bin Laden was keeping a very low profile, and there's no evidence that he was being protected by anybody inside the Pakistani security apparatus.
But what are the Pakistanis doing with the Haqqani network?
Well, that is a good question, and that really relates to the future of Afghanistan. So the Haqqani network is really, they're running Kabul, they run the north and the east of the country. Siraj Haqqani, who is the leader of the Haqqani network now, is now the Minister of Interior in Afghanistan. According to the United Nations, he is on the leadership council of Al-Qaeda. So here you have this extraordinary sight of a member of Al-Qaeda being a senior cabinet member in the Taliban government today, with the role of head of DHS and head of the FBI combined in the Ministry of the Interior. Not only that, I interviewed in Doha relatively recently at a public event Ambassador Fitton Brown, who runs the Al-Qaeda Taliban cell at the UN. And I said that I'd read that there were 14 people on the 33 cabinet members who were first appointed by the Taliban who were sanctioned in some way by the UN. He corrected me. He said it was 17 members. So here you have this extraordinary kind of cabinet, more than half of whom are sanctioned by the UN. And one of whom is a leading member of Al-Qaeda, one of whom is a leader of Al-Qaeda, on the leadership council of Al-Qaeda. So how did that relate to the Pakistanis? The Pakistanis have very warm relations with the Haqqani network. And, President Trump always talked about the Iran deal being the worst in history. The worst in history is the Taliban peace deal, which the Taliban didn't adhere to a single part of the agreement, separate from Al-Qaeda, engage in real peace negotiations with the Afghan government. The only thing they did do in the agreement was not attack American troops, which of course they had a strong interest in not doing because they wanted American troops to leave. So it's not hardly they're going to do that as we were all leaving. So this was the worst deal in history. And we're circling back to the Haqqani network. An American citizen still being held by the Haqqani network. His name is Mark Friedke, and he is an American contractor who was seized by the Haqqani network. As part of the peace agreement, we, the United States, pressured the Pakistani government to release the Afghan government, to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners and ISIS prisoners, many of whom went back to the battlefield. We couldn't get our one American prisoner back at a time when we had a huge amount of leverage. And so this deal was an absolutely terrible deal. The Taliban got 5,000 of their men out of prison. The Haqqani network wouldn't release this one person. So I think that says a lot about the nature of this deal. And the Pakistani government has had very close relations with the Haqqani network for decades now. And I don't think that's changed.
It sounds like the Taliban have lost complete control of civil society, including feeding its own people, and we've cut off all aid to Afghanistan. The reports of a widespread famine are horrifying. There was a story on NPR this morning. What do you know of the situation there? How dire is it?
I think you've outlined it pretty well. I think we will find ways to get aid to people in Afghanistan through organizations like the UN, through Médecins Sans Frontières, through the Taliban are not opposed to NGOs like the UN and Médecins Sans Frontières and other, the ICRC. They weren't opposed when they were in power the last time. They know that they need these organizations. So we will be able to work with those organizations to get aid to the Afghan people, in the process of which we're going to have to deal with the Taliban, which is a very unpleasant reality. When I was in Doha, I was speaking to Qatari officials in October, and they were, they have good relations with the Taliban, and they're playing a very helpful role, I think. Their concern is twofold. One, that the one that, Ralph, that you've mentioned, that they're hugely incompetent, don't know what they're doing. They're also concerned the Taliban itself might fracture into three different groups. One is a sort of the military Taliban led by Siraj Haqqani. The other is the Doha Taliban led by Mullah Baradar, and the other one is the kind of commander of the faithful Taliban in Kandahar. And then that fracture could then lead to civil war, which would make the situation even worse. So, there is a real dilemma that policymakers in the United States and other countries face, which is you're going to have to deal to some degree with the Taliban. And we've seen that already. Tom West, who took over from Zal Khalilzad, has talked directly with the Taliban. So is David Cohen, who's the deputy director of the CIA. And just in the nature of things, if the place is not to totally collapse, there's going to have to be some dealings with them. They would like recognition, but they can function without it. They only had 3 countries recognize them when they were last in power. They would like, they'd like the $9 billion of money that's in Afghan money that's in American banks to be released, but they can function without it. And one thing that I think people tend to forget is, they have 38 million people under their control, and they can tax and extort those people and they also are sitting on the world's largest heroin supply. So I think that they can function without the things. Of course, they'd like international recognition. Of course, they'd like some of the money that we're holding, but I think they can live without it. But, on the other hand, we will have to deal with them in some shape or form whether we like it or not, if we're to avoid some total catastrophe there.
How hard is it to find out what's going on there? I mean, I assume there are no Western journalists.
The Taliban, when they were last in power, they allowed Reuters to function, they allowed the AP to function, they allowed Al Jazeera to function, they allowed BBC to function, they allowed me to go there as an independent, journalist. And I think they've become even more. I think there's some very good reporting coming out of Afghanistan. Sudarshan Raghavan at the Washington Post, Susanna George at the Washington Post, Thomas Gibbons Neff at the New York Times, Matthew Aikens, who's also a former New America fellow, who just did this massive 20,000 word piece in the New York Times Magazine about kind of the final days, how the Taliban came to power. And so I think that there's plenty of coverage coming out. It's hard for me to see my CNN colleagues, Nick Robertson, Clarissa Ward, and others, are able to report there. So, I think we're getting a reasonably good picture of what's going on. I think Ralph mentioned the report on NPR. Presumably that was done in Afghanistan. I didn't hear it myself. So I think we are getting coverage. I think the coverage is pretty good. And by the way, and also it's a country that people in the press corps have covered for a long time and know pretty well. And so, it's just not a tabula rasa. Pam Constable at the Washington Post has been reporting there since 1999. And so I think that we're getting a reasonably good picture of what's happening.
You've written one book, two books on Bin Laden and one on Al-Qaeda itself. To what extent do they still exist, and how powerful are they compared to, say, ISIS or IS? Are they integrated in any way?
Yeah, I mean, right now I think Al-Qaeda is in pretty bad shape. I mean, depends. The Al-Qaeda Central, the group that attacked us on 9/11. But that said, it can change because these groups, as I mentioned earlier, they prey on weak hosts, and so Al-Qaeda can regroup. I mean, we have the extraordinary Colin Powell, who's the Undersecretary for Policy. The definition of a gaffe in Washington is telling the truth in public, and he was giving congressional testimony. He was asked a question about ISIS-K, the group, the local ISIS group, and he said that ISIS-K could carry out an attack in 6 months in the United States. Now, I have no idea. He obviously didn't clear that particular thing with anybody at the White House, since it kind of contradicts a lot of things the White House has said. So, and I think it's also untrue. I don't think ISIS-K can carry out an attack in the United States in 6 months' time, but Al-Qaeda certainly can regroup and start training people for attacks in Europe. I mean, attacking the United States is very hard because of all the defensive capabilities we have that didn't exist before 9/11, and they're sort of dual use in the sense that many of these defensive capabilities are also useful against right-wing extremists or anybody who wants to carry out acts of political violence. It's much harder than it today in the United States than it was, say, in the 70s when you had the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and Puerto Rican nationalists and many hijackings. We've set up an apparatus that prevents that kind of thing, not completely, but pretty well. So Al-Qaeda, I think right now is weak. It's led by a weak leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's been a weak leader for a long time. He hasn't been able to resuscitate the group. But the wider jihadist project is certainly got a new lease of life by this great victory in Afghanistan. From the jihadist point of view, they've had three great victories. One was pushing the Soviets out of Afghanistan in '89, two, 9/11, and three, pushing the United States out of Afghanistan in 2021. And I think we're in a new iteration of the movie we've seen before. It never ends well for the jihadists. Embedded in their DNA or the seeds of their own destruction. But we saw with ISIS that it could take over territory the size of Portugal and population the size of Bulgaria. And now we have the Taliban controlling an entire country, being the de facto government, controlling 38 million people. I think in the long term that's good for the jihadist movements, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other groups. I mean, the Pentagon used to say that there were 20 jihadist groups in Afghanistan. Some of them are like focused on local issues like Lashkar-e-Taiba is against India, and Islamic movement of Uzbekistan wants to change the government of Uzbekistan. But the fact is, I think that this has been a victory for them. Al-Qaeda, according to the UN, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban remain closely aligned. So while they're weak now, they can certainly, if they're allowed 3 or 4 years of breathing room, you can see them training people and carrying out attacks in the region, potentially also in Europe.
How would you have handled the exit from Afghanistan?
President Obama went to West Point on December 1st, 2009, and gave a speech announcing a surge of 30,000 troops into Afghanistan, then also announcing the withdrawal date. And there was a reason that he wanted, he wanted to signal that there wasn't a blank check here. He wanted to tell the American people, I'm not signing a blank check in the middle of this financial crisis. He wanted to tell get the Afghan government to get its act together. But it backfired spectacularly because the message, I remember that day very clearly. I went to the White House and there was a background briefing by White House officials, and then CNN got a hold of Obama's speech at 3 p.m. and the crawl on CNN was U.S. withdrawals from Afghanistan 18 months from now. That was the headline, and that was the headline. The way that people interpreted Obama's speech at West Point was not the surge, but was the withdrawal date, and that was the interpretation of the Pakistanis. That was the interpretation of the Afghan people and government, and that was the interpretation of the Taliban. And then, President Trump had campaigned on getting out of Afghanistan. So we've been talking about leaving for a very long time. So I think that, there was a debate in the Pentagon and elsewhere during Obama's first term about what to do in Afghanistan. One of the options was go light and go long. And I think ultimately that would have been the smartest approach. We're still in South Korea 75 years after the end of the South Korean War, the Korean War. We have 25,000 troops there, obviously with the permission of the South Korean government. And we were in Afghanistan with the permission of the Afghan government. They wanted us to be there. This is not sort of a situation where they wanted us to go, quite the contrary. I think we were at a politically sustainable place in the United States with 2,500 troops on the ground. Even if there were 3,500 troops, there was sort of some fuzzy accounting, but the point is it was a relatively small number. And I think it was politically sustainable, economically sustainable, and it was in the interest of the United States, and also it was in the interest of the Afghans. And now we have a situation where the Taliban, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, is now back in control. They're in a much stronger position than they were before 9/11 because the opposition movement against them collapsed within 2 weeks, the armed opposition. And, they're now heavily armed. They've been fighting for 20 years. They've got all our American materiel. And they're there for quite some period of time. So I think we could have just said, we have a long-term commitment to Afghanistan. Afghans don't care if there's 2,500 troops or 1,700, or they don't care about the number. Yes, there's a difference from a military point of view, but they just wanted to, basically for us to stay. And if we'd had one Marine outside the American embassy and said our commitment to America, to Afghanistan is long-term, which costs you nothing to say, I think that would have been smarter than what we did do. Because we created a total collapse of confidence. Because when we left, then our NATO allies left. It's easy to forget there were more NATO allied troops in Afghanistan than American troops. 7,000 largely NATO troops were in Afghanistan. They left when we left. There was also 16,000 contractors, 6,000 of them Americans. Those were contractors were keeping the Afghan Air Force basically alive, because we'd given them all these sophisticated American helicopters and planes that the Afghans simply can't service. So everybody left when we left, and then of course there was a narrative the Afghan army didn't fight. No, that's completely untrue. 66,000 Afghans were killed in the war, fighting soldiers and police fighting the Taliban. They just saw that it was basically untenable, and they surrendered. But up to that point, that they fought pretty well, and they fought pretty well because they had medevac, because of the Air Force. They fought pretty well because they had close air support, because of the Air Force. And when that disappeared, there was a total collapse in confidence amongst the armed forces and then the government, and what happened. So I think there could have been another way to do this, which is to just keep a relatively small force talk about a long-term commitment. And we wouldn't have 6 months ago, the Taliban controlled, there were 34 provincial cities in Afghanistan. 6 months ago, they didn't control those cities, and now they control all of them. So it was an unforced error.
It seems as if we had left our 2,500 in there, plus the Allied troops, we would have only really been in control of the Kabul region.
Certainly the Taliban controlled quite a number of rural districts, but they didn't control any provincial cities until we basically said we're leaving, and then they started taking them over. And I think there's a very American thing, which is H.R. McMaster talks about strategic narcissism, which is we always think about it in our own, as and that somehow if we leave, things will be better and peace will break out. If I went back and I looked at the headlines when we pulled out of Iraq in December of 2011, there was a Reuters headline: U.S. pulls out of Iraq, war over, essentially. Well, the war didn't end. In fact, it amplified. And there were a similar set of headlines during, as with the Taliban, when we said we pull out of Afghanistan, somehow our absence will produce peace. And right now we do have the Taliban, and the number of deaths have gone down, and the war is over for the moment. But I don't see that as being. There was a bunch of people who, been excluded by the Taliban, ethnic groups that aren't represented, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks. Of course, women and are still excluded from the workforce and mostly excluded from education, and once they get to be teenagers. And so, the Taliban certainly are in charge right now. But, I think if you look at in the next 3 or 4 years, that can change. The Taliban can start making mistakes. Resentments can start building. They don't have, of the 33 members of the cabinet, the senior members they appointed in the first round, not one is anything other than an ethnic Pashtun, who are a plurality. They're not the majority of the country. They're the largest ethnic group. And so 60% of the country is not even represented at the cabinet level. And obviously no women, of course. So a lot of things have changed in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. We tend to forget we know what went wrong, but what went right is, a whole bunch of people got connected to the outside world through their cell phones. A whole generation of people sort of moved on from the idea that the Taliban were any kind of answer. A whole generation of women were educated and had jobs. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the Taliban deals with that reality. But right now, they're pretending that none of that happened.
Just to shift a little bit, how do you think the January 6th attack would have played out if Trump had not gotten rid of his generals, which you've written about, Kelly, McMaster, Mathis?
I mean, Mark Meadows is certainly not General Kelly. And the acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller, is not Jim Mattis. And the National Security Advisor at the time was Robert O'Brien, who certainly wasn't H.R. McMaster. How it all played out, I don't know. I mean, I think if you look at, I think there was a more normal Trump administration when you had HR as the National Security Advisor, when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense. I think if you look at the first year or two, there were actually real successes that they had on the foreign policy front, whether it was the total defeat of the ISIS geographical caliphate. They actually added troops in Afghanistan. They didn't pull out, as Steve Bannon wanted. The rules of engagement changed in Syria so that the Pentagon could actually take more aggressive action against ISIS. Rules of engagement that have been put in place during the Obama administration. So I think there were, and also there was the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, both of which emphasized China as a peer competitor, which is now, of course, standard kind of Washington belief. But there was, the Pentagon started doing more naval exercises and freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea during those first couple of years. So I think from a national security perspective, there was a much more normal enterprise. So, might that enterprise have reacted in different ways to what happened on January 6th? Who knows? I mean, one thing is that there wasn't a huge amount of time for all the decisions that would needed to be made. I'm not excusing what happened. I'm just saying that it was 187 minutes. And, obviously the January 6th committee is going to delve into in some detail about who said what to whom. But I mean, I think, Jim Mattis, having said that he would never say anything critical of Obama, of Trump, changed his mind after the June event outside St. John's Church and outside the White House, in which he said that President Trump is the first president in my lifetime who has done everything to divide us rather than bring us together. And so you can imagine, I think a different team might have tried to do something different. I mean, clearly this team was also pretty alarmed. Now we know what Mark Meadows was receiving, and they even if Donald Trump Jr. is saying this has got to stop in these texts. I mean, so, but I think that's a very interesting question. Might that team have taken a stronger, quicker, more proactive approach? I think very possibly.
I was horrified to read recently that the Senate has approved something like 6 or 8 nominees for ambassadorships around the world, and that basically they're refusing to approve most of Biden's nominees for ambassadorships. Why isn't Biden raising holy hell about this? I believe we have no ambassador to Britain right now.
Maybe ambassadors don't matter so much anymore. I mean, I don't know.
How do you assess Biden's broader foreign policy initiatives?
Well, we're about to get a really big controlled experiment answer to that question, which is what Putin does in Ukraine. And, if you look at what the Chinese official media said after we pulled out of Afghanistan, the day after, Chinese media, official media, wrote an editorial saying, look, Taiwan, this is what you get when you're aligned with the United States. And so we, even if you agree with the decision to pull out, we certainly signal weakness with the decision and also the execution. And, I think our adversaries, are paying attention. And do they believe Tony Blinken when he says there's going to be serious consequences if Putin goes into Ukraine? I don't know. But my guess is that it would be pretty easy for Putin to take Ukraine from a military perspective. And we have sanctioned a lot of people in the Russian Putin circle already. So the one thing that would really get their attention, well, there is one thing that we could do that would really get their attention, which is, but it might also have very blowback effects on the Russian people, which is preventing Russian access to the SWIFT banking system, which we could do. I mean, there are sanctions we could take against the Russians that would really hurt, and that would be one of them. So, I mean, I think to answer your question, I mean, I think the Afghan decision was, was a failure on lots of levels, which I've already sort of given my view of. And the big test will be Putin in Ukraine in the next few months. If I was going to invade Ukraine, I do it over Christmas. And in fact, that's what the Soviets, of course, did with Afghanistan. It's a great time to do it when there's less government attention, less media attention. So if he doesn't do it over Christmas, then maybe he's not going to do it. We don't know. He himself may not know. But I think we're going to have an answer relatively soon, and then we'll see what Biden will do, and that will, of course, that will be the really big test. Because I mean, if you really believe that great power, peer competition is the kind of flavor of the day, how Biden reacts to that is an interesting question.
Do you have a view on China and how far we should go to sanction them?
The Biden policy is the same as the Trump policy on China, broad strokes. I mean, there's now tremendous bipartisan agreement around the fact that, the theory that the Chinese would liberalize as they became more prosperous turned out to be disastrously wrong. And in fact, they've become more authoritarian as they become more prosperous. And so, but I think there's there's almost no one in official Washington who doesn't think that the Chinese are a serious issue. And I think Biden has sort of continued that policy from Trump, and that any illusions about sort of what the Chinese are doing and the need to block them in some way have evaporated. You know, the Trump administration had a with that early Trans-Pacific agreement, they pulled out of that simply because it was an Obama deal. But that was actually a quite good agreement to kind of contain China with a group of like-minded countries from an economic perspective. So I think Biden is, they could do more potentially on the Uyghur issue, on the Hong Kong issue. I don't think they've said a great deal about it. There's bipartisan agreement that putting 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps is a bad thing, and ending Hong Kong's sort of liberal-ish polity is also a bad thing. The real question will be, if China tries to take Taiwan. But interestingly, the Australians have made, Kevin Rudd, I think, has made some very strong statements about Taiwan. The Japanese defense minister has publicly made some very strong statements. So people in the region, it's not just us that don't want the Chinese to take Taiwan. It's also people in the region who are saying so publicly. So, of course, that will be the big test.
The fact that we withdrew from Afghanistan has led a lot of people to say, well, we certainly wouldn't militarily defend Taiwan.
But the main thing is to arm the Taiwanese so that they can prevent being easily swallowed by the Chinese.
But the analysis is the time of U.S. interventions is over.
I don't believe that. I mean, I think the United States in its own mind thinks of itself as sort of not involved in interventions, but I think our history shows that we intervene quite a lot. And since the United States was founded as an anti-empire project, in our own minds, we never do empire-like things, but we still have, troops and, hundreds of thousands of troops around the world. There's no great American appetite for an intervention right now, but, anywhere in the world. And both Trump and Biden sort of shared that, and to some degree Obama. But, if events change things.
Peter, what's your view on what's going on between Israel and Iran in this cyber war and assassinations, of course?
I think Max Boot had a piece in the Post, which I just read the headline of, but which I agree. Which, essentially, we let the Iranians have a nuclear weapon. I mean, the Iran nuclear deal was a good deal. It was negotiated between, with our closest partners, the British, French, and the Germans. The Iranians were adhering to it, according to 9 separate inspections by the independent inspectors based in Vienna, and also according to the intelligence community. One of the reasons that Dan Coates was fired I think a key reason that he was fired as director of national intelligence is he publicly testified that the Iran nuclear deal was working, which didn't go down well with President Trump. So the point is that nuclear deal was working, and they were keeping to the 3.47% enrichment, and now they've gone to 20%. And you've seen there's stories that they might even have enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon already. So the Israelis, they see it as existential, and they're doing everything to ensure that that gets interrupted, whether it's killing key scientists or whether it's kind of cyber warfare or whatever measures are necessary. And what's my view of that? I don't really have a view. I mean, the Israelis see it as an existential issue, and they are they're not waiting around to be surprised by Iran sort of declaring that it's a nuclear state.
And the 15-year agreement was too much waiting around from their point of view.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was supposed to be till 2035, I think. By the way, when we did nuclear negotiations with the Soviets, we didn't say to the Soviets, basically knock off all your subversive activities all around the world. And we didn't, it was, they were, when you do, because the Trump and the folks who kind of criticized the agreement said that, well, we didn't get enough from the Iranians. Well, in any deals are never going to be perfect. And I think we managed to extract what we really wanted, which is the only thing worse than the Iranians doing what they're doing is the Iranians armed with a nuclear weapon. And we basically prevented that. And now that's not going to be prevented. And then, of course, the Saudis almost certainly will arm themselves with nuclear weapons because they have the money and the capacity and relations with the Pakistanis and the Chinese who can help them with that. And then you could imagine the Arab Emirates also getting in the act. And we have exactly what we hoped we wouldn't have, which is a nuclearized Middle East that goes beyond simply Israel.
And there's India and Pakistan. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Peter. It was very enlightening. We're all going to go out and buy your book.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay.
Everybody has a good afternoon.
Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye.